India is likely to be the world's next superpower. This is something the Indian government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has been saying again and again. Now, Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times, has written a widely read piece where he talks about why India will become a superpower. So I've got live with us at this time Martin Wolf from the Financial Times, joining us from London. Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We've been tracking your articles and your work for a long time, but I don't think any other piece has been shared quite as widely as the one where you predict that India will likely be a superpower. So can you start by explaining to those who are watching at this time why you think India is well poised to be the next world superpower?
Well, I suppose it comes down to just a few things. First, as everybody knows, India is a very, very, very big country with a larger population than any other country, and that advantage will continue to grow. So, as I point out, and plausibly by the middle of this century, it will have an appreciably bigger population than China, and probably at least 4 times that of the US. So if India gets its output per person to, say, a quarter of the US level, which is considerably below what China has today, over the next 25 years, which seems to me a pretty plausible outcome, it assumes essentially that economic growth continues on roughly the same trend as since 1990. It's been quite stable. There have been ups and downs, but quite stable. If it continues at that rate for another quarter of a century, India will have achieved GDP per head at least a quarter of the US levels in real terms. And therefore, its aggregate economy will be as big as the US. It will not be as big as China, which I expect, under quite conservative assumptions, to be the biggest. But it will be clearly in a class with those other two. And these will be far and away the 3 biggest economies in the world.
What are the key milestones you'd be looking at? Is this trend, do you think, inevitable, or are there key markers that you'll be tracking very closely to see whether India stays on this journey to be an advanced economy by the middle of this century?
Well, it's certainly not inevitable. This is absolutely clear. The history of growing economies is that sustaining, say, just 5 or 6% growth with what is we are talking about, not China's 10 or so, over what then be 60 years is a remarkable achievement. I mean, that's happened to other countries, but it's not common, and things can go wrong. You can have political instability, you can have at home, you can have major upheavals in the world economy. I do discuss in my article one of the most important, which is growing protectionism in the world, but I suggest that gives India some real opportunities too, because it is in quite a favored position. And of course, policy has to be stable and pro-growth. And in India's case, that includes, I think, strengthening industry. I think it's quite important for industry to continue to be dynamic. I think it's important that India continue to succeed in the world economy, to be attractive to inward investment, to generate exports, and of course to generate a growth which uses as much of the population as possible. So there are lots of things that have to go right. But I think that India has done well enough. It looks to me politically stable enough. It has clearly the human resources it needs to sustain this growth. And I think it's a reasonable bet.
The big debate in India comes down to per capita GDP. How much does each person in our population, what is his average level of wealth? And there India currently stands at about $2,500. This is as per the International Monetary Fund data from April 2024. Now, 13,845 is the current classification for per capita income to classify as a developed country according to the IMF. Do you think we're on the path to be able to lift many in our population to those kind of levels? Because the big debate in India is around income inequality and whether the rich are getting richer, there's a higher concentration of capital amongst the uber rich, and whether the benefits are adequately going down the income pyramid.
Well, I think that, and I've discussed this too, that the chances, well, that the challenge of becoming a genuinely developed, all-round developed country with a per capita income comparable to that of the developed countries, that challenge over the next quarter of a century is enormous. And I think it's very unlikely. I use slightly different numbers, which I won't go into in detail because it's a bit technical, but I think very crudely, growth in GDP per head would have to rise to about 8% a year, 7.5 to 8% a year to become a developed country by 2047, which was, of course, the Prime Minister's objective. That will be an extraordinary achievement. But if we assume that India continues at a growth rate of 4.5% to 5% in per capita income, perhaps a little bit more over that period, it will clearly be well into the upper middle income category, which is where China is now, and it would be a considerably more prosperous country than today, at least twice as rich, and the per head. And I think that's achievable. But certainly, I wouldn't pretend for a moment it's going to be easy. But becoming actually a high-income country under plausible assumptions by 2050 is, I think, a bit of a stretch. By 2060 or 2070, it's perfectly possible if the world remains reasonably safe. But this is getting on for half a century. It's a long time to think about.
The IMF managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, in her recent post talks about how the world faces a decade of tepid growth and popular discontent, because India doesn't rise by herself. India rises in a global context. The headwinds at this moment are anti-globalization. Countries are becoming more insular, inward-looking. Therefore, how do these global headwinds potentially impact India's rise versus the golden period for China, where China was growing at a time when globalization was the flavor of the world at that time?
There's no doubt it will make it more difficult, and I take this into account. I mean, remember, during its heyday, as you said, up to about 2012, China was growing at about 10% a year, and that was helped by its exports growing even faster. Now, I don't think the world economy would absorb that, and I also don't think India is likely to achieve that for a whole host of reasons, which we can't go into. It would be an extraordinary acceleration if India got anything close to that. But let's assume that India grows at, say, as I said, 5 or 6%, not 10. Assume the world economy growth is slow, so it's 3% or so. That means India's growth will be about twice as fast as the world economy. And of course, I also argue that would require probably exports to grow twice as fast as world exports, because at the moment, world trade and world GDP are growing at roughly the same rate. Now, that looks quite a stretch. But remember, at the moment, India is still a very small share of world exports. Merchandise exports, if I remember correctly, just a couple of percent. It's much better in services, but even then, China and the US and other countries, UK, are well ahead of it. So I think India can grow faster than the world economy. India's exports can grow faster than the world economy, and India can grow faster unless the world economy collapses. And I argue that doesn't seem very likely, short of a major war, which is, of course, unpredictable and horrifying to think about. So that is possible for India. It will require good policy, and it will require, in my view, that India continues to trust that it can compete in world trade. And here India has some huge advantages. It is seen as a broadly friendly nation by Western countries. It has good relations with countries in the south, obviously not with China, but with others. And India is an obvious +1 country. We're trying to diverge
No, so let's spend a
reduce
moment on that,
dependence on
because
China. So
the
it's all good.
no,
There are
so I want to
good
spend a
opportunities
moment
here.
on this China plus one opportunity. In your column, you describe India as a, as a positive connector country. To what extent, according to you, has India been able to benefit, or is in the direction of being able to benefit from the China plus one pivot in global supply chains? Is that benefit really coming towards India, or is it really going elsewhere and India getting a very small, suboptimal part of it?
I think it is clearly becoming a country people are thinking about hard in the West, but it is certainly not the first port of call. I mean, it's clear in the short run, Vietnam has been doing extraordinarily well, and it raises some big issues because Vietnam is doing well in part because it's importing supplies, components, and so forth from China, and that might become a difficulty. So there are questions about whether the US and European countries will accept imports from other countries like Vietnam or India for that matter, which actually are made in significant measures with Chinese components. It's very difficult to avoid because China is far and away the biggest manufacturing country in the world. So that's a big question. And then, of course, the key issue is, does India offer the quality of infrastructure, the efficiency of administration, the attractions to invest foreign investors, which will persuade them that this is a completely
So what's your answer to that?
base.
Because
We don't
making
know.
India a manufacturing hub is one of the key pillars of the government's policy framework. To what extent do you think we've already succeeded in, through various incentives like production-linked incentives, through favorable taxation, corporate taxation regimes, to make India an attractive destination, and what more, according to you, Mr. Wolf, needs to be done?
I think it has clearly improved India's attractions. There's no doubt about that. Whether it's enough is, to me, not clear. It is important to stress that foreign investors still are very nervous about administrative obstacles. Will things really go perfectly smoothly? The infrastructure is improving massively. Is it up to Chinese levels yet? No. Obviously not. There's a concern about the quality of the labor force and the education and training. They need to be certain that work will proceed smoothly. So I would say people are looking at India very carefully. They are thinking about it hard, but the country hasn't yet been sold to the world as a base for manufacturing, exports. But of course, India also has the service possibility, which is a very big one. It's not just manufacturing, it's a very broad range of options. But I would say policy has to continue to improve if the government wants to get these sorts of results, but it's feasible.
How do the recent Lok Sabha election results impact India's growth curve? One argument is, if India had a government with a very strong majority, they would have been able to push forward on the path of economic reform with greater purpose. That a coalition government, to some extent, while the direction stays the same, but it might slow the intensity of reform. Could that push India's growth journey back, in your view, Mr. Wood?
It's very difficult for an outsider to guess precisely the connection between political realities and economic performance. My sense from my very recent trip is that this really shouldn't derail progress. It looks as though there will be a stable government. It will be somewhat chastened, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That's part of democracy, and it shows the vibrant strength of Indian democracy. And I think it is quite likely, I hope, to persuade the government that economic reform and economic progress is the core thing they offer the Indian people. That's what they want. And so that's what they should focus on. And it didn't seem to me that there's any vast opposition to that in the country. People want a better life. So I hope that this will actually encourage a greater focus on, still greater focus on economic performance, which is, I think, what India needs and the Indian people deserve. So I'm optimistic on that. But I can't be sure. I mean, who does know what's going to happen politically?
India's growth, especially on the export side, has had a very strong services component. Now the question is, how do technological advancements, in particular artificial intelligence, tools like ChatGPT, how do they potentially impact some of those jobs which have really moved the Indian economy in the decades gone by, but some of those jobs now potentially are increasingly being automated and may not require Hyderabad or Bengaluru or Gurgaon or Noida?
That's a very big question, and I think it's a real concern. I mean, this is of course a concern worldwide, a huge concern. What is going to be the impact of this? I've read quite a bit about this, and at the moment I would say that people are not clear whether these are going to be substitutes or complements, or how far it will be one or the other. Are we going to actually massively reduce employment in the broadly defined service sector across the world, or are we going to find that workers are more efficient, but we will need more because we will be better off and we can do more, and that in fact humans and machines will turn out to be highly complementary. It is worth noting that while there is that really big question, India, of course, has the advantage that its service labor in all areas is cheaper and has a very large number of people who can do this. And so there's this general shift from the developed countries with high-cost labor to developing countries with lower cost labor. And I think it's quite possible that will offset the effect of AI. But the honest truth, this is a very new, recent invention, innovation, and we don't know how that's going to play out. And the economy will have to be very flexible. It will change in many ways over the next 20 years or so, and this will be part of that adjustment.
Let's spend a moment by zooming out of India and looking at what's happening globally. And I want your broad interpretation of what the results in the United Kingdom and in France and other places where there have been elections recently, and in the UK you got a government with a very firm majority. That's not the case in France. How does all of this together impact global growth?
Well, very broadly, we are in a period of political instability. And one of the characteristics of that period is a lot of the politicians are not, as it were, operating within the system, they're operating against the system. So it's anti-system politics. And that creates vastly more uncertainty about the future of the politics in many high-income countries than we had before. And you can see that in the British election with the great success of Nigel Farage. Of course, you can see it in France. That's obvious. You could see that in the European Union elections, and you can clearly see that in the US, where Donald Trump represents exactly that. So we are in a period of extreme political uncertainty with the possibility of quite revolutionary developments, which are very, very difficult to predict. And of course, also, we are, and that's the other really big aspect, we have this emerging Cold War, as it were, between the West broadly defined and a bloc around China and Russia and Iran. This makes the world hugely unpredictable. In these situations, one of the most important features is rising nationalism. And rising nationalism is obviously anti-globalization, and we are seeing rising protectionism. That is one of the reasons for slowing world growth, and is certainly going to make world trade growth more difficult. But as I said before, I do believe of the major powers, India is particularly well positioned to take advantage of what opportunities there are. But there's no doubt there are very big uncertainties about the future development of the world and the world economy and the political regimes we're going to see.
In your view, is the trend towards this new Cold War likely to exacerbate? China, Iran, Russia, North Korea on the one side, a US-led bloc on the other. Is this likely to get worse, or do you think these two blocs will find a way of being able to, with tensions, coexist?
That's in a way the biggest geopolitical question. And there's another possibility which must be mentioned, that if Donald Trump becomes president, that the Western Bloc will fragment to a significant degree. So we would almost have a three-way split. The relatively optimistic view is that it would become a bit like the old Cold War, where the relationships were difficult, but head-on war was avoided, and the countries that were linked to the West at that stage did pretty well. But we were separate. The difficulty with that is, of course, we hope that we will avoid war. Of course we do. But the difficulty is, of course, China is fully part of the system. It's part of the world system. So cutting it out is almost impossible. The leaving aside friction leading to war, we can imagine that the events there. The really big question is whether protectionism becomes so enormous, and Donald Trump suggests it might, that relations really break down completely, and then we could have a sudden unraveling of world trade, a real reversal, as happened in the 1930s, and that disruption will be difficult to handle. Even so, as I suggest, India has very good relations with a lot of countries, and there are going to be a fair number of chances that it might be able to pick up.
Finally, it now seems more likely that Donald Trump is the front runner to be the president of the United States. How could a Trump presidency impact global trade and in the context of your piece, India's rise?
Well, at the moment, there's sort of slightly good news. Donald Trump has announced that he will impose a 60% tariff on China's goods and 10% tariffs on everybody else. Now, I don't know whether he will do that. He's a pretty unpredictable person. But if he did that, that would clearly enormously accelerate the shift of imports to the US from China to other countries. If it's done in the form I've just suggested, it's not, he doesn't look at the China content in exports to America, which he might do, but assuming he doesn't, that will create enormous opportunities for other countries to start exporting to the United States while importing some of the components and so forth from China. So I think it's not necessarily terribly harmful if that's all he does, is just an attack on China. Of course, China will retaliate against the US, but that again will create opportunities for other countries. So I think it is conceivable, but you never know with Donald Trump, that his bite for most countries will be worse than his bark. He's just a wildly unpredictable human being. But India, again, is probably pretty well positioned. He seems to like your prime minister. He seems to get on well with him. He doesn't express any hostility towards India. He sees it as most Americans do, as a potential ally, even if sort of slightly secret, well, semi-secret, against China. So I think even with Trump, the opportunities, at least for India, don't look to me to be too bad.
Finally, you've spoken so far as an economist, as a football fan. What's the data? What is purchasing power parity and the state of the two countries telling you about England versus Spain? Could the cup finally be coming home? What's your sense?
Well, my view is Spain is obviously the favourite for confidence record. But in any match of this kind between two teams, all of whose players are really top-class professionals, anything can happen. And I suppose I would be rather happy to see England win.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens over the weekend. Thank you very much for joining us, Martin Wu. Appreciate your thoughts. I'm sure a lot of people will be latching on to every word where you're thinking that India would be the world's next superpower, as they'd say. In our country, aapke muh mein ghee shakkar. Thank you very much for joining us on this broadcast. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times.
Great pleasure.